Hey there, welcome back. Before we dive in, take a deep breath and let the stress of the day melt away. I'm really glad you're here, and I'd love to get to know you better. So if you had to choose, what would be your favourite food? Let me know in the comments. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. And enjoy. The morning fog clung to London streets like a guilty secret, and Eli Morgan pulled his hard hat lower as he approached the skeletal remains of the old textile factory. At 34, he'd seen enough construction sites to know when a building was dying, and this Victorian monument was gasping its last breath. The developers wanted it gutted and transformed into luxury flats, but Eli found himself drawn to the history trapped in its sooty bricks. For weeks now, the dreams had been getting worse. Black smoke filling his lungs, soot-covered hands reaching out from darkness, the terrible sound of collapsing steel and screaming voices. He'd wake up choking, his sheets drenched in sweat, tasting coal dust on his tongue. It made no sense. He'd never worked in a mine, never been inside this particular factory before the restoration job began. The rest of his crew wouldn't arrive for another hour, giving him time to inspect the towering smokestack that dominated the building's eastern wall. The structure was a marvel of 19th century engineering, rising nearly 200 feet into the grey sky. Today he needed to assess its stability before they began demolition on the surrounding workshops. Inside the base of the chimney, Eli's flashlight beam danced across the interior walls. What he saw made him pause. Strange markings covered the ancient brickwork. Initials carved deep into mortar, handprints pressed into soot-darkened surfaces, names scratched with desperate fingernails. He read aloud, running his fingers over the letters T. Whitlock. The name seemed to echo in the hollow space above him. As he stepped closer to examine the markings, the floor beneath his feet gave way with a sickening crack. Eli plunged downward into darkness, his last conscious thought the taste of coal dust filling his mouth and the sound of his own scream disappearing into the shaft above. When consciousness returned, it came with the acrid smell of coal smoke and the distant clang of metal on metal. Eli's eyes watered as he struggled to sit up, coughing black soot from his lungs. But something was wrong. The air itself felt different, thicker, more oppressive. The quality of light filtering down from above had changed from the clean, fluorescent glow of modern London to something dimmer, more yellow. He stumbled out of the narrow alley beside the smokestack and onto a street he didn't recognise. The cobblestones were slick with something that might have been mud but smelled like industrial waste. Horse-drawn carts clattered past, their wheels throwing up sprays of filth. Men in threadbare clothes and women in long, dark dresses hurried by without meeting his eyes. The buildings around him were the same Victorian structures he'd been working on, but they looked new, their bricks sharp-edged and red, their windows gleaming despite the perpetual haze that seemed to hang over everything. "You there?" a rough voice cut through his confusion. Two men in blue uniforms approached, truncheons already in hand. "What's your business lurking about in private property?" Before Eli could answer, a woman's voice interrupted. "Officers, please, this man is my brother. He's been ill, working the night shift at the foundry. I've been looking everywhere for him." The woman who stepped between Eli and the constables was perhaps 40, with greying hair tucked under a worn bonnet and hands red and raw from hard labour. Her eyes, though kind, held the weight of someone who had seen too much suffering. "That's so, Martha." One of the officers eyed Eli suspiciously. "Funny how your brother's clothes don't match the others coming off shift." Martha's grip on Eli's arm tightened. He got himself turned around in the fog, fell into the river trying to find his way home. Look at the state of him. She gestured to Eli's modern work clothes, now torn and stained with soot and what he hoped was just mud. The constables exchanged glances but seemed satisfied. As they moved on, Martha hurried Eli down a narrow side street. "Don't know what game you're playing, stranger, but you've got the look of someone running from trouble. Name's Martha Briggs, and I lost my real brother to the cholera 3 years past. But these streets eat men alive, and I won't see another soul taken if I can help it." Her small room above a bakery was sparse but clean, with a single window that looked out over a maze of factory smokestacks. As Martha bustled about preparing a meal of bread and thin soup, Eli tried to process what was happening to him. The woman spoke of cholera and foundries as present realities. The clothes hanging on lines outside the window were straight from a museum display. The very air he breathed tasted of coal smoke and industrial chemicals. "What year is this?" he asked finally. Martha paused in her stirring. "Year?" "It's 1852, near the end of November. What kind of fever have you been running that you'd forget such a thing?" The date hit Eli like a physical blow. Somehow, impossibly, he had fallen not just down a chimney shaft, but through time itself. And if this was truly November 1852, then he knew exactly where he was and what was about to happen. Over the next 2 days, as Martha nursed him back to strength, Eli ventured out into the Industrial Revolution London that surrounded him. The factory he had been restoring in his own time was here in its full, terrible glory. Mortlock Mills dominated several city blocks, its multiple smokestacks belching black clouds into the perpetual grey sky. Children no older than 10 scurried between buildings carrying heavy loads of coal and cotton. The sound of machinery never stopped, a constant grinding roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. Eli found himself drawn to the factory gates at shift changes, watching the parade of hollow-eyed workers streaming in and out. Many were children, their faces prematurely aged by hard labour and coal dust. It was among these young workers that he first spotted Thomas. The boy couldn't have been more than 10, but he moved with the quick, sure steps of someone who had learned to navigate the world's dangers early. His job was chimney sweep, and his clothes were permanently stained black with soot. When Eli saw him helping a smaller child who had stumbled under a heavy load of coal, something in his chest twisted painfully. Thomas reminded him of his own younger brother Danny, who had died in a scaffolding collapse 5 years ago, a death Eli still blamed himself for. "You've been watching us," Thomas said one evening as Eli lingered near the factory gates. "Martha says you're her brother, but you don't talk like the others. You ask strange questions about things everyone knows." Eli knelt to the boy's level. "What do you know about the factory? About how safe it is inside?" Thomas glanced around nervously before answering. "Safe? Nothing in there's safe. The foreman says we're lucky to have work at all. But—" He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Some of the older boys, they talk about sounds coming from the upper levels, creaking and groaning where there shouldn't be any. And Mortlock himself, he's been having meetings with men who come in the night. They bring papers and money, and afterward, he always looks pleased with himself." That night, Eli made his way through the twisting alleys that surrounded Mortlock Mills. The factory never truly slept. Night shifts kept the furnaces burning and the machinery running. But there were gaps in the patrol patterns, moments when a careful man could slip inside unnoticed. The interior of the factory was a vision of industrial hell. Massive machines loomed in the darkness like sleeping giants, their metal arms and wheels catching what little light filtered through grimy windows. The air was so thick with cotton fibres and coal dust that breathing felt like drowning. And everywhere, the heat, waves of it rolling off the furnaces in the building's lower levels, making the whole structure feel like the inside of a giant oven. Eli made his way toward the upper catwalks, following half-remembered architectural drawings he'd studied in his own time. If his memory was correct, the disaster would originate in the northeastern section, where a main support beam had been weakened by years of excessive heat and inadequate maintenance. As he climbed the narrow metal stairs, he could feel the entire structure swaying slightly with each step. When he found the beam in question, his heart sank. Even in the dim light, he could see the hairline cracks spreading through the metal. The bolts that held it in place were rusted and loose. Below this beam stretched a vast open floor where hundreds of workers would gather in 4 days' time for the annual Workers' Festival, a rare celebration that Mortlock grudgingly allowed to boost morale. Eli spent hours examining the structural damage, using his modern knowledge of engineering to assess what would be needed to prevent the collapse. It would require skilled welding, proper support materials, and at least a dozen men working together. But even as he planned, he knew the real challenge would be convincing anyone to listen to him. His first attempts at warning people fell on deaf ears. The few workers who would speak to him at all dismissed his concerns as the ravings of someone who had clearly suffered some kind of head injury. When he tried to approach the factory foreman, he was threatened with arrest for interfering with mill operations. Even Martha, despite her kindness, clearly thought he was suffering from some form of madness. It was Thomas who finally offered a different perspective. "You're not mad," the boy said one evening as they sat by the fire in Martha's small room. "Different, yes, but you know things you shouldn't know if you were just another mill worker. The question is whether you're here to help or to make things worse." "Help?" Eli said without hesitation. If I can. Thomas studied his face in the firelight. Then we'll need proof, something the adults can't ignore, and we'll need allies, people who are already suspicious of Mortlock and his operations. Over the next 2 days, Thomas introduced Eli to a small group of workers who had begun to organise in secret. They met in the basement of an abandoned warehouse, speaking in whispers about fair wages and safe working conditions. Their leader was a man named James Fletcher, whose own son had lost 3 fingers to a poorly maintained cutting machine. "You're asking us to risk everything on the word of a stranger," Fletcher said, after Eli had explained his concerns about the factory's structural integrity. "If we're caught interfering with mill property, we'll all be in prison or worse. And if we do nothing, 214 people will die in 3 days," Eli replied, "including children, including your son." It was the specific number that finally convinced them. Eli's certainty, his detailed knowledge of exactly where and how the collapse would occur, suggested either prophetic insight or inside information. Either way, they decided it was worth the risk. The plan they developed was simple but dangerous. They would enter the factory during the night shift change, when security was lightest and the noise of the machinery would cover their work. Using materials salvaged from other construction sites around the city, they would reinforce the failing beam and strengthen the surrounding support structure. Eli would guide the work, drawing on his modern construction experience, while Thomas would serve as lookout and messenger. But as they prepared to put their plan into action, Eli made a disturbing discovery. While scouting the factory's exterior, he overheard a conversation between Mortlock and a man he didn't recognise, conducted in the shadows behind the main building. "The insurance policies are all in order," Mortlock was asking. "Everything's arranged," the stranger replied. "The fire will appear to start from a faulty furnace valve. Complete destruction is guaranteed, and the investigators will find exactly what we want them to find." "And the timing?" "The night after your workers' festival. Let them have their celebration. It will make you appear more sympathetic to the claims investigators. Then we eliminate the evidence and collect the payout." Eli's blood ran cold. Mortlock wasn't just neglecting safety. He was planning to burn down the entire factory for the insurance money. The collapse during the festival would kill hundreds, but those who survived would die in the fire the following night. The scale of the planned disaster was beyond anything Eli had imagined. When he shared this information with the group, their resolve only strengthened. "All the more reason to act," Fletcher said grimly. "If we can prove the mill was deliberately weakened, we can expose Mortlock's entire scheme." The night of their mission, London was shrouded in one of its thickest fogs of the season. The group of 8 men and Thomas slipped through the factory gates like ghosts, their movements masked by the perpetual noise of the machinery. Eli led them to the northeastern section, where the failing beam waited in the darkness above. Working by the light of shielded lanterns, they began the delicate process of reinforcing the structure. Eli guided the placement of salvaged iron beams and steel plates, while the others welded and bolted them into position. The work was back-breaking and dangerous. One spark in the wrong place could ignite the cotton fibres that filled the air. One wrong move could bring the entire section crashing down on their heads. As dawn approached, they were nearly finished. The main support had been strengthened, additional braces installed, and the worst of the structural damage repaired. But there was still one crucial joint that needed welding, a connection high up in the rafters that would require someone small and agile to reach. "I'll do it," Thomas said, already strapping on the safety gear they had improvised from rope and leather. "It's too dangerous," Eli protested. "That's a 2-person job minimum, and we don't have 2 people small enough to fit up there," the boy replied. "Besides, I know these spaces better than anyone. I've been climbing through mill machinery since I was 7. Against his better judgment, Eli allowed Thomas to make the climb. The boy moved through the rafters with the confidence of a natural acrobat, the welding torch held carefully in one hand while he used the other to maintain his balance. As he worked on the final joint, sparks showered down like stars, illuminating the vast space below. It was then that disaster struck. The chain mechanism that controlled one of the main pulleys, weakened by years of heat and stress, snapped without warning. The massive iron wheel it supported began to fall, directly toward where Thomas was working. The boy saw it coming and tried to leap clear, but his safety rope caught on a protruding beam. Without thinking, Eli launched himself upward, scaling the support structure with desperate speed. He reached Thomas just as the wheel crashed through the space where the boy had been moments before. But as he grabbed the child and swung him to safety, the impact sent a shock through the metal framework. Eli's arm was caught between two colliding beams, the bones snapping with a sound like breaking wood. Pain flooded through him, but there was no time to stop. Even as his vision greyed at the edges, Eli guided Thomas through the final welding work, the boy's small hands completing what his injured arm could no longer manage. They finished just as the sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the mill, the morning guards making their rounds. Fletcher and the others helped Eli and Thomas escape through a basement tunnel that connected to the old sewer system. As they made their way back to Martha's room, Eli clutched a rolled bundle of papers against his chest, the blueprints and documentation he had prepared, showing exactly what they had done and why it had been necessary. The Workers' Festival took place 3 days later, just as scheduled. Despite Martha's protests, Eli insisted on watching from a nearby rooftop, his broken arm bound in a makeshift sling. Below them, hundreds of workers and their families crowded onto the main factory floor, enjoying a rare day of celebration and rest. As the afternoon wore on, the building creaked and groaned under the weight of so many people, but the reinforcements held. The beam that should have failed remained solid, the supports they had installed doing their job exactly as Eli had hoped. When evening came and the celebration ended, every person walked out of that factory alive. The next night, as Mortlock's arsonists prepared to carry out their plan, they found their path blocked by constables and fire brigades. Thomas had delivered Eli's documentation to the authorities, complete with detailed drawings showing both the structural repairs and evidence of Mortlock's insurance fraud. The mill owner was arrested as he tried to flee the city, his entire scheme exposed. But Eli's work was not finished. Martha had told him of an old tradition among the chimney sweeps. When one of their number died, if another sweep climbed to the top of the deceased's regular chimney and descended at midnight, it was said the soul could find its way home. A young sweep named Peter had died of fever just days before, and his regular assignment had been the great smokestack of Mortlock Mills. "It's madness," Martha protested as Eli prepared to leave her small room for the last time. "That chimney's 200 feet high, and you've got a broken arm." "It's the only way," Eli replied, though he couldn't explain why he was so certain. "I don't belong in this time, Martha. I have to find my way back." Thomas insisted on accompanying him to the factory. The boy had somehow acquired a spare chimney sweep's uniform, complete with the brushes and ropes of the trade. "Peter was my friend," he said simply. "I want to help his soul find peace." As midnight approached, Eli stood at the base of the great smokestack, looking up into the darkness above. The climb would be treacherous, especially with his injured arm, but something deep inside him knew this was the path home. He tucked the soot-stained blueprints into his jacket, proof of what he had accomplished, what he had changed. The ascent was a nightmare of pain and exhaustion. Each rung of the iron ladder set into the chimney wall was a struggle, every movement sending fresh waves of agony through his broken arm. But gradually he made his way upward, the sounds of the city fading below until there was nothing but the wind and his own laboured breathing. At the top, London spread out beneath him like a carpet of flickering lights. The fog had lifted for once, revealing a city both alien and familiar. This was the same London he knew, but transformed by time and progress. Somewhere out there, in a future he could barely imagine, his own time was waiting. As the church bells began to toll midnight, Eli started his descent. Down he went, into the narrow shaft that led to the heart of the chimney. The walls closed in around him, thick with soot and memories. His lungs filled with coal dust just as they had during his original fall. The darkness was complete, absolute, pressing against him like a living thing. At the bottom of the shaft, consciousness began to fade, the taste of soot on his tongue, the feeling of falling through time itself, the sound of his own heartbeat echoing in the narrow space. And then nothing. Light returned gradually, filtered through what seemed like layers of gauze. Eli found himself lying in rubble at the base of the smokestack, but everything had changed. The factory around him was no longer the hellish industrial maze he had left behind. Instead, it had been transformed into something almost beautiful, a memorial space with clean lines and modern amenities. He struggled to his feet, his arm no longer broken, his clothes once again the modern work gear he had been wearing when this all began. But as he looked around, he could see that the world had changed in subtle ways. Where luxury apartments had been planned, there was now a museum dedicated to industrial safety and workers' rights. The smokestack itself had been preserved as a historical monument. A brass plaque near the entrance caught his attention. In memory of the 214 lives that would have been lost in the Mortlock Mills collapse of November 1852. This disaster was prevented by the brave actions of anonymous workers whose plans and documentation were discovered hidden in the brickwork during renovations in 1923. Their sacrifice reminds us that ordinary people can change the course of history through courage and determination. But it was what he saw next that made his heart skip a beat. High up on the interior wall of the chimney, preserved behind a sheet of protective glass, was a small handprint pressed into the sooty brickwork. Beside it, scratched in a child's careful letters, was the name T. Whitlock. Eli pressed his own hand against the glass, matching his fingers to the print beneath. Thomas had left his mark, a message across time to let Eli know that his sacrifice had not been forgotten. The boy had lived, had grown up, had perhaps had children of his own who carried his name into the future. As he walked out into the clean London air, Eli felt something shift in his chest, a weight he had carried for 5 years finally lifting. He had not been able to save his brother Danny from that scaffolding collapse, but he'd saved Thomas and hundreds of others. The guilt that had haunted his dreams was replaced by something else. The knowledge that sometimes, against all odds, it was possible to make things right. But as he made his way through the memorial grounds, Eli discovered that the changes went deeper than he had first realized. A series of informational displays lined the pathway, each one telling a different piece of the story he had helped to write. One panel described the formation of the first workers' safety unions in London, sparked by the discovery of the Mortlock conspiracy. Another detailed the revolutionary building codes that had been implemented across England following the near disaster, codes that had saved thousands of lives over the decades that followed. There were photographs too, grainy daguerreotypes from the 1850s showing the faces of the workers who had survived. Eli studied each image carefully, searching for familiar faces among the crowd. There, in a group photo labelled Mortlock Mills Safety Committee 1855, he found what he was looking for. A young man, perhaps 17 or 18, stood proudly in the centre of the group. Though his face had filled out and his clothes were cleaner than Eli remembered, there was no mistaking those intelligent eyes or that determined expression. Thomas had not only survived, he had thrived. The display text beneath the photograph made Eli's throat tighten with emotion. Thomas Whitlock, youngest member of the Safety Committee and later instrumental in establishing London's first chimney sweep benevolent society. His detailed knowledge of factory infrastructure, gained through years of dangerous work in confined spaces, proved invaluable in identifying safety hazards throughout the city's industrial districts. Whitlock went on to become one of London's most respected building inspectors, credited with preventing numerous potential disasters through his meticulous attention to structural integrity. Further along the path, Eli found a small garden area dedicated to the children who had worked in the mills. At its centre stood a bronze statue of a young boy with soot-stained clothes and a determined expression, one hand reaching up as if to grasp something just out of reach. The plaque at its base read, "In honour of the child workers whose courage and sacrifice paved the way for labour reforms that continue to protect workers today." Their dreams were bigger than the darkness that surrounded them. Eli sank onto a nearby bench, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what his actions had set in motion. He had thought he was simply preventing a single disaster, saving the lives of a few hundred workers. But the ripple effects had spread across decades, transforming not just individual lives but entire systems of law and social protection. A jogger passed by, earbuds in, completely absorbed in her morning routine. A businessman hurried past, checking messages on his phone. Normal people living normal lives in a world where workplace safety was so routine, so deeply embedded in society's fabric, that they likely never even thought about it. None of them knew how close history had come to taking a very different path, or how the actions of one desperate man and a brave 10-year-old boy had changed everything. As Eli sat in the memorial garden, watching the morning sun burn away the last traces of fog, he found himself thinking about Martha. What had become of the kind woman who had risked her own safety to help a stranger? He walked back to the museum entrance and asked the elderly volunteer at the information desk if there were any records of Martha Briggs. The woman's face lit up with recognition. "Oh, Martha Briggs. She's quite famous around here." After the Mortlock affair, she became one of the first women to testify before Parliament about working conditions in the textile industry. Her accounts of life in the tenements helped shape the Housing Reform Act of 1857. There's actually a wing of the museum dedicated to her work, the Martha Briggs Centre for Social Justice. She lived to be 84, remarkable for her time, and ran a home for displaced workers right here in this neighbourhood until she was well into her 70s. Eli spent another hour exploring the Martha Briggs Centre, reading about the woman who had saved his life and then gone on to save countless others. Her writings, preserved in glass cases, spoke of the dignity of a labour and the responsibility of society to protect its most vulnerable members. In one particularly poignant letter to her sister, written in 1867, she mentioned a mysterious brother who had come into her life briefly, but changed everything. "I often wonder about poor Tom, the confused man I helped during that terrible November of 1852. He spoke of things no one could understand, but his concern for the mill children was genuine. I like to think that wherever he ended up, he found the peace that seemed to elude him." The final exhibit in the centre showed a photograph of an elderly Martha, surrounded by dozens of children, orphans and displaced workers' children she'd cared for over the years. Her eyes still held the same kindness Eli remembered, but now they also reflected a deep satisfaction, the contentment that comes from a life spent in service to others. As the morning progressed, Eli realised he had been unconsciously delaying his departure from the memorial site. Something about leaving felt like breaking a connection, severing the last thread that tied him to that remarkable week in 1852. But he knew he couldn't stay forever. He had his own life to live, his own work to do. Walking toward the exit, he paused one last time at the preserved handprint in the chimney wall. This time, however, he noticed something he had missed before. Scratched into the soot beside Thomas's name were other marks, symbols that looked almost like a child's attempt at writing blueprints. Tiny drawings of beams and supports, careful notations about stress points and load distribution. Even as a boy, Thomas had been thinking like an engineer, documenting what he had learned and passing it on to future generations. Eli pulled out his phone and took a photograph of the handprint and its surrounding marks. Not as a memento exactly, but as a reminder. A reminder that the smallest actions could have the largest consequences, that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power to change the world, and that courage came in many forms, sometimes as a desperate man falling through time, sometimes as a child willing to climb into dangerous heights to save others. The dreams of coal dust and collapsing steel would not return. In their place, he would dream of a small boy climbing through rafters with the skill of a born acrobat, of workers walking safely home to their families, of a future changed by the courage of ordinary people willing to risk everything for what was right. But now he would also dream of Martha's kind eyes, of Thomas growing into a man who dedicated his life to protecting others, of the countless unnamed individuals whose lives had been touched and improved by that one desperate night in a Victorian factory. Behind him, the great smokestack rose into the London sky, its bricks holding secrets and memories, its shadows filled with the echoes of lives saved and history rewritten, and somewhere in those shadows a child's handprint remained as proof that love and sacrifice could transcend the boundaries of time itself, creating ripples of hope that would spread across generations, touching lives that would never know their true source, but would benefit from their endless, ever-expanding circles of compassion and change. The water off the southern coast of Crete held its secrets close, 30 metres down where the Mediterranean sun could barely penetrate. Kai Morgan descended into the darkness with practised ease, his breathing steady through the regulator, the weight of his equipment familiar against his body. 3 years of searching these waters, 3 years since the fisherman had whispered about the new cave system, opened by winter storms, and finally he had found it. The entrance yawned before him like a mouth frozen mid-scream, carved into the limestone cliff face that dropped away into the abyss. His underwater light cut through the gloom, revealing the tunnel that beckoned him deeper. This was what he lived for, the moment when the known world fell away and something older, something untouched by modern hands, waited in the darkness. Kai checked his dive computer. 28 metres, plenty of air remaining. He kicked forward into the cave, following the beam of his light as it revealed walls covered in what looked like deliberate markings, too regular to be natural erosion. The tunnel curved upward, and his pulse quickened. An air pocket? Impossible at this depth, yet his instruments didn't lie. He surfaced into a cathedral of stone, his light playing across walls that seemed to pulse with their own inner radiance. The air was thick, almost viscous, carrying scents that belonged to no modern ocean. Copper and honey, burning olive oil, the musk of animals that had been extinct for millennia. As Kai pulled the regulator from his mouth and took his first breath, the world began to spin. The water around him glowed gold, as if someone had dissolved the sun into the sea. His vision blurred, darkness creeping in from the edges, and the last thing he saw before consciousness fled was his own reflection in the still surface, but wrong somehow, wearing clothes that weren't his, in a place that couldn't exist. Voices reached him first, speaking in a language that should have been incomprehensible, but somehow wasn't. The words flowed over him like water, ancient and musical, carrying meanings that bypassed his rational mind and settled directly into understanding. He was lying on rough stone, warmed by sun that felt different from any he'd known, cleaner somehow, without the haze of modernity. He breathed still. Poseidon has returned him to us. Kai opened his eyes to see faces leaning over him, weathered by sun and sea, but unmarked by the particular exhaustion of the 21st century. Their clothes were simple linen and leather, dyed in colours that seemed to glow with their own light. One man, older than the others, studied Kai with eyes the colour of deep water. "Stranger," the man said, "the sea has given you back to us. What message do you carry?" Kai sat up slowly, his modern diving suit torn and salt-stained but still recognisable for what it was. The men stepped back in wonder, touching amulets at their throats. Behind them, Kai could see a harbour unlike any he'd ever known, ships with painted eyes on their prows, buildings that rose in impossible spirals, and beyond them, a palace that seemed to have grown from the living rock itself. This was Knossos. But not the ruins he'd explored as a graduate student, not the careful reconstructions and crumbling foundations. This was Knossos alive, its walls painted in brilliant frescoes, its courtyards filled with the sound of voices and commerce and something else. The particular quality of light that existed only in dreams, or memories, or the stories told by grandmothers who remembered when the world was younger. The fishermen, that's what they were, he realised. Their boats pulled up on the shingle-bearing nets that still dripped with the morning's catch, helped him to his feet. They spoke among themselves in rapid, musical tones, gesturing toward his equipment with a mixture of awe and concern. "Come," said the older man, "Daedalus will wish to see you." The name hit Kai like a physical blow. Daedalus. Master craftsman, builder of labyrinths, father of Icarus. The myth walked toward him on living legs through streets that smelled of bread baking and bronze being forged, through a world where legends had not yet learned to be legends. The palace of Knossos rose before them, its walls painted with dolphins and flowers, with young men leaping over bulls and women in elaborate dresses that left their breasts bare. Kai had seen these images recreated in museums, studied them in textbooks, but here they lived and breathed, the paint still wet with intention and meaning. They found Daedalus in his workshop, a space that defied every assumption Kai had ever made about Bronze Age technology. Tools that should not have existed for another 1,000 years hung from the walls, alongside others that belonged to no era he could name. The man himself was younger than Kai had expected, perhaps 50, with the kind of hands that spoke of a lifetime spent bringing impossible things into being. "So," Daedalus said without looking up from his work, a device of bronze and leather that seemed to move with its own internal logic. "Poseidon sends me a craftsman dressed in the skin of sea creatures. What do you build, stranger?" Kai looked down at his diving suit, at the fragments of his equipment that the fisherman had carefully gathered. In this place, they did look like artifacts of some impossible craft, technology so advanced it appeared magical. "I build passages," Kai said carefully, "between what is and what was. I travel beneath the waves to find things that were lost." Daedalus finally looked up, and Kai saw in his eyes the same hunger that had driven him to dive deeper, search longer, risk more than any reasonable person would. It was the look of a man who had touched the impossible and found it insufficient. "Show me," Daedalus said. Kai removed what remained of his regulator, his dive computer, the pieces of his gear that had survived the transition between worlds. Daedalus examined each piece with the focused intensity of a man who understood that knowledge was power. But more than that, knowledge was art, and art was the closest thing to magic that mortals could achieve. "You breathe water," Daedalus murmured, turning the regulator over in his hands. "In a manner of speaking. The device captures air from above, stores it, allows me to carry the sky beneath the waves. And this," Daedalus indicated the dive computer, its digital display dark but somehow still compelling in this place where bronze was the height of technology. "It remembers depth, time, the body's needs. It watches over the diver like a guardian spirit." Daedalus smiled, and Kai understood that he had just passed some kind of test. "Then you are indeed a craftsman. Come, meet my son." They found Icarus in the palace gardens, a boy of perhaps 16 who moved with the unconscious grace of youth, but carried himself with the careful precision of someone who had learned early that his father's attention was both gift and burden. He was beautiful in the way that mythical figures were supposed to be beautiful, not pretty, but compelling, as if the light fell on him differently than on other people. "Father," Icarus said, rising from where he had been examining a mechanical bird that ticked and whirred with bronze clockwork. "Who is your guest?" "This is Kai," Daedalus said. "He builds passages beneath the waves. Perhaps he can teach you something about the spaces between elements." Icarus looked at Kai with a kind of direct interest that young people had before the world taught them to be guarded. "You travel underwater? Like a fish?" "Like a fish that remembers the sky," Kai said, and was surprised at how easily the metaphor came. In this place, it seemed, everything was metaphor, and metaphor was everything. The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality that Kai recognised but couldn't quite name. It was the feeling of being suspended between sleep and waking, between memory and experience, between the world as it was and the world as it should be. He stayed in the palace as Daedalus's guest, working alongside the master craftsman to understand technologies that seemed to operate on principles that had been forgotten before Archimedes was born. But it was with Icarus that Kai found himself spending most of his time. The boy had a hunger for knowledge that reminded Kai painfully of someone else, someone who had asked too many questions and pushed too hard and paid the ultimate price for his curiosity. His brother Marcus had been like that, brilliant, reckless, convinced that the next discovery would be the one that mattered, that would make sense of everything that came before. Marcus, who had died 3 years ago in these same waters, diving alone in pursuit of a story that existed more in his imagination than in historical fact. Marcus, who had pushed past safe diving limits because he was sure he was on the verge of something extraordinary. Marcus, whose body Kai had found 2 days later, his equipment failed, his air gone, his face peaceful in death as it had never been in life. "You're sad," Icarus observed one afternoon as they sat on the palace walls, looking out over the harbour where ships with painted eyes bobbed at anchor. "You carry loss like my father carries his tools, always within reach, always ready to be used." Kai looked at the boy, startled. In his own time, teenagers were distracted, absorbed in their own concerns. But here, in this place where myth had not yet learned to be separate from reality, even the young carried wisdom that belonged to older ages. "I had a brother," Kai said. "He died seeking something that existed only in stories. And now you seek the same thing?" "Number. Now I seek him." Icarus was quiet for a long moment, watching the ships move in the harbour like toys in a bathtub. "My father builds wings," he said finally. "He says we'll fly away from here, away from King Minos and his anger and his labyrinth. He says we'll touch the sun." Kai felt something cold settle in his stomach. The myth was unfolding around him exactly as it was supposed to, exactly as it had been told for 3,000 years. Daedalus and Icarus, imprisoned by King Minos, building wings to escape their captivity, flying too close to the sun until the wax melted and Icarus fell into the sea that would bear his name. "Flying is dangerous," Kai said carefully. "Everything worth doing is dangerous," Icarus replied, and his voice carried the particular conviction of youth, the certainty that consequences were things that happened to other people. "My father says that men who never risk anything never discover anything, that safety is just another kind of prison." That night, Kai sought out Daedalus in his workshop where the master craftsman worked by lamplight on structures of wood and wax and feathers that could only be wings. They were beautiful in their simplicity, and terrible in their implications. You know how this ends, Kai said. Daedalus looked up from his work, his hands stained with wax and his eyes bright with the fever of creation. I know how stories end. This is not a story. In my time, it is. In my time, you and your son are a cautionary tale about the dangers of flying too high, of reaching too far. In my time, Icarus drowns. Your time? Daedalus set down his tools and studied Kai with the intensity he usually reserved for his inventions. You speak as if you come from the future, as if this moment, this choice, has already been made. Perhaps it has. Perhaps we're all just playing out a script that was written before we were born. Daedalus laughed, but there was no humour in it. Then why are you here? If the ending is already written, if nothing can be changed, why did your gods bring you to this place and time? Kai had no answer for that, because he had been asking himself the same question since the moment he woke on the rocky shore. Why him? Why now? What was he supposed to do with the knowledge of what was coming? There's something else, Daedalus said, returning to his work but speaking without the distraction Kai had expected. The wings require a special preparation. They must be blessed with foam from the sea during the blood tide, a phenomenon that occurs once every 18 years, when certain plankton bloom in conjunction with a solar eclipse. The foam carries properties that strengthen the bond between elements. Kai felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. When? 5 days. The eclipse comes in 5 days, and with it the blood tide. And if you don't use the foam, then the wings are merely clever toys. With it they become something more. Something that can carry a man between worlds. Between worlds. Kai understood then why he was here, what he was supposed to do. The blood tide, the eclipse, the wings. They were a doorway, a passage back to his own time. But the myth demanded its sacrifice. Someone had to fall. Someone had to pay the price that gods and stories required. The next 3 days passed with the inevitability of a tide. King Minos, suspicious of Daedalus and his foreign guest, began to tighten his grip on the palace. Guards appeared where none had been before. Questions were asked about the work in the workshop, and more than once Kai caught sight of men watching from shadowed doorways. He fears betrayal, Daedalus explained as they worked together on the wings, their hands moving with the practiced efficiency of craftsmen who understood each other without need for words. Minos knows that I built his labyrinth, and he knows that any man clever enough to build a maze is clever enough to find his way out of one. So we're prisoners. We've always been prisoners. The only question is whether we die in our cells or die trying to escape them. Icarus, meanwhile, had taken to visiting the harbour each day, watching the ships come and go with the restless energy of a young man who sensed that his world was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. He would return each evening with stories of merchants from distant lands, of travellers who spoke of cities beyond the horizon, of possibilities that existed beyond the borders of Crete. I want to see it all, he told Kai one evening as they walked along the palace walls. Every island, every shore, every place where men have built something beautiful or discovered something new. My father's wings will carry us there. And if they don't? If something goes wrong? Icarus shrugged with the casual dismissal of youth. Then we'll have tried. That's more than most men can say. On the 4th night, as the eclipse approached and the sea began to take on the reddish tinge that preceded the blood tide, King Minos made his move. Soldiers surrounded the workshop, confiscated the wings, and placed Daedalus and Kai under house arrest. The official charge was treason, but everyone understood the real crime, the audacity to dream of escape. He's afraid, Lyra said. She was a priestess in the temple of Potnia, the Great Mother, and had been helping them in secret, drawn by the same hunger for something beyond the ordinary that seemed to afflict everyone who came into contact with Daedalus's work. Afraid that if you succeed, others will follow, that the idea of escape will spread like fire through the palace. They were meeting in secret in a storage room deep beneath the temple, where the walls were carved with symbols that predated any script Kai recognized. Lyra had brought wine and bread, but none of them had much appetite. "Can you get us to the wings?" Daedalus asked. "Perhaps, but not all of you. The guards are too many, too alert. One person might slip through, no more." "Then I'll go," Kai said immediately. "No." Daedalus's voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "The wings were built for escape, but more than that, they were built for purpose. Icarus will not fly this time. I will not let the myth take him." "Then who?" "You will. You understand the danger, you know the price. And perhaps Perhaps your presence here means that the story can be rewritten. Or perhaps it means that I'm the one who was always meant to fall. They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts. Finally Lyra spoke. There's another way. The wings that were confiscated were not the only pair. Daedalus, you've been working on a second set, smaller, more manoeuvrable. Daedalus nodded reluctantly. They're untested. The balance is different, the lift characteristics unknown. They were intended as prototypes. But they exist. They exist. The night of the eclipse arrived with all the drama that myth demanded. The moon began its slow passage across the face of the sun just as the blood tide reached its peak, turning the water in the harbour the colour of old copper. From their window in the palace, Kai could see the foam that churned at the base of the cliffs, red as blood and thick as cream, carrying within it the alchemical properties that would transform Daedalus's careful engineering into something approaching magic. Lyra came for them just after midnight, moving through corridors she'd memorised as a child, leading them through passages that servants used and secrets that priests kept. They retrieved the wings from their hiding place in the temple crypts, along with vessels to collect the sacred foam. The climb to the cliffs took longer than expected. The wings, even the prototype pair, were awkward to carry, and more than once they had to stop and listen for sounds of pursuit. But finally they reached the high precipice where white limestone met red sea, where the ancient world fell away into darkness and possibility. The eclipse was nearly complete now, the sun reduced to a thin crescent that cast everything in an eerie twilight. Below them, the blood tide churned and foamed, and Kai could smell something in the air that belonged to no earthly ocean. Ozone and copper, honey and salt, the scent of boundaries being crossed. The foam must be fresh, Daedalus said as he lowered a rope and bucket toward the churning waters. It loses its properties within minutes of being separated from the tide. Kai helped him haul up bucket after bucket of the strange foam, which glowed faintly in the eclipse light and seemed to move with its own internal currents. As they painted it onto the wings, the feathers began to shimmer and change, taking on properties that had nothing to do with the birds they'd come from. It's time, Daedalus said. Kai looked at the wings, at the cliff, at the sea that waited below. Somewhere in his own time, 3 years in the future, his body was floating in a cave system 30 metres underwater, sustained by equipment that couldn't possibly work but somehow did. Somewhere, his brother Marcus was 3 years dead, and Kai was 3 years older, and no closer to understanding why the people we love insist on leaving us. The myth says Icarus fell because he flew too close to the sun, Kai said. The myth is wrong, Daedalus replied. Icarus fell because he forgot that the ocean was there to catch him. Kai strapped on the wings, feeling their weight settle across his shoulders like responsibility made tangible. The eclipse reached totality, and the world went dark except for the glow of the foam and the strange light that seemed to emanate from the wings themselves. Remember, Daedalus said, you're not trying to reach the sun. You're trying to reach the sea. Kai stepped to the edge of the cliff. Below him the blood tide churned and foamed, and he could see shapes moving in its depth that belonged to no taxonomy he knew. Above him, the eclipsed sun hung like a black hole in the sky, surrounded by the silver fire of its corona. He jumped. The first moments were pure terror, the ground falling away and the wings catching air with a sound like thunder. But then training took over, not the kind learned in flight school, but something deeper. The knowledge that every human carries in their bones of what it feels like to move through 3 dimensions without support. The wings responded to his movements like extensions of his own body, lifting him on thermals that rose from the warming sea, carrying him higher than any human had a right to go. Below him, Crete spread out like a map drawn by gods, all bronze and gold and the deep blue of water that had never known the touch of industrial chemistry. For a moment, Kai understood the temptation that had destroyed Icarus in every version of the story. Up here, with the wind in his face and the world spread beneath him like a promise, it was easy to believe that height was safety, that distance from the earth meant distance from its sorrows and limitations. But he had not come here to escape. He had come here to return. The eclipse began to wane, the sun emerging from behind the moon like hope from behind sorrow. The wings shimmered and began to change, the foam that had blessed them starting to lose its otherworldly properties. Kai felt the shift immediately. Where before the wings had felt like part of his body, now they felt like what they were: wood and wax and feathers, held together by hope and craftsmanship. He began to descend, not falling but diving, angling toward the sea in a controlled spiral that used every updraft and air current to maintain stability. The myth demanded that Icarus fall, but it didn't specify how. Below him, the blood tide reached its peak intensity, the water so red it looked like liquid fire, so thick with foam it seemed solid enough to walk on. Kai hit the water not with the helpless crash of a falling body, but with the clean entry of a diver who knew his element. The wings dissolved around him as he sank, the wax melting in water that was somehow warm despite the depth, the feathers separating and floating away like benedictions. Down he went, through water that tasted of copper and thyme, past fish that glowed with their own light and coral formations that moved with purposes too alien to comprehend. The pressure should have crushed him. The cold should have stopped his heart. But instead he felt only a profound sense of rightness, as if he were finally returning to a place he had never been but always known. At the bottom of his descent, in darkness so complete it had weight, Kai found himself back in the cave, floating in the impossible air pocket that had started everything. His dive computer, somehow still functional, read 3 minutes elapsed time. 3 minutes to live a myth, to rewrite a story, to understand that some journeys can only be made by going backward. He surfaced in the modern Mediterranean, his equipment intact, his air supply barely touched. But something had changed. In his hand he held a single feather, not synthetic, not plastic, but woven from Minoan linen and the quill of a seabird that had been extinct for 3,000 years. Back on the boat, back in his own time, Kai sat in the afternoon sun and examined the impossible artifact. His hands were steady for the first time in 3 years, his breathing calm and regular. Somewhere in his chest, the knot of guilt and loss that had driven him to these waters had finally begun to loosen. That evening he called the university and told them about the fresco. They found it exactly where he said they would, in a newly excavated chamber at Knossos that had somehow escaped previous archaeological attention. The image was everything he had described: a figure in flight, wearing what could only be interpreted as some kind of breathing apparatus, trailing sea foam from wings that caught the light like living things. But it was the inscription below the fresco that caused the real excitement among the scholars. Written in Linear A, the undeciphered script of the Minoans, it was somehow perfectly legible to Kai, though he told no one about this particular ability. Icarus did not fall, it read. He chose to return. Kai retired from diving 6 months later, though he never explained why. He kept the feather in a sealed case on his desk, labelled with the words from the fresco. Sometimes, late at night, when the moon was dark and the sea called to him, in voices he almost recognised, he would take it out and hold it up to the light, remembering the feel of wings that had carried him between worlds, the taste of air that belonged to no earthly atmosphere. He never dove again, but he no longer needed to. He had found what he was looking for in the depths, not his brother, not absolution, not answers to questions that had no answers. He had found something rarer and more valuable, the understanding that some stories are not warnings but invitations, not endings but beginnings. And sometimes, when the light fell just right through his window, he could swear he saw Marcus standing there, not lost but transformed, not drowned but reborn into something larger than the small grief that had defined both their lives. His brother smiled and nodded and faded back into the golden light that connected all times and all places, leaving behind only the certainty that love, like myth, could be rewritten by those brave enough to change the ending. The silence in the Beijing Museum's restoration wing was broken only by the soft scratch of Liang Wen's brush against parchment. At 27, his fingers moved with the practiced precision of someone who had spent years breathing life back into ancient texts. The afternoon light filtered through tall windows, casting golden rectangles across his workspace, where fragments of history lay waiting for resurrection. Liang paused, studying the charred scroll before him. It had been recovered from a temple fire in Shanxi province just weeks ago, its edges blackened and brittle as autumn leaves. The characters visible through the soot were unmistakably Qin dynasty, the angular, authoritative strokes that had unified a fractured empire over 2 millennia ago. These were the marks that had transformed 6 warring states into one nation under Emperor Qin Shi Huang's iron will. He had been orphaned at 8, left to navigate the world with nothing but his grandmother's stories of distant ancestors and a natural affinity for the ancient scripts that most scholars found intimidatingly complex. The museum had become his sanctuary, these restoration chambers his true home, yet despite his expertise, despite the recognition from colleagues who marvelled at his ability to decipher the most damaged texts, Liang carried a persistent emptiness, a sense that some crucial piece of himself remained forever out of reach. The damaged scroll bore a label in his supervisor's meticulous handwriting: Qin-era manuscript fragments, origin uncertain, handle with extreme care. Beside it sat a small vial of ash collected from the temple ruins, dark powder that had once been ink and intention, and human breath made permanent. Liang's training had taught him to work methodically. First, he photographed every fragment from multiple angles. Then he began the delicate process of separation and cleaning. But as the afternoon wore on, and the restoration room emptied of other workers, something compelled him to deviate from protocol. The characters emerging from beneath layers of soot seemed to whisper of urgency, of secrets that could not wait for proper bureaucratic procedure. He prepared his ink with unusual haste, mixing pigments with practiced motions that had become as natural as breathing. But as he reached for his water dish, his elbow caught the vial of temple ash. It shattered against the stone surface of his work table, the dark powder cascading into his freshly prepared ink like smoke dissolving into water. For a moment Liang simply stared. Protocol demanded he discard the contaminated mixture and begin again. But the ink had taken on an unusual quality, not quite black, but shot through with threads of silver that seemed to move independently of any current. The mixture seemed to breathe. Against every instinct of his professional training, Liang dipped his brush into the transformed ink. The moment the bristles touched the surface, the liquid clung to them with unusual tenacity, as though reluctant to let go of the brush, even as it eager to meet the parchment. He began to copy the clearest characters from the damaged scroll: Yong Heng de Ji Yi, eternal memory. But as his brush moved, the characters seemed to shimmer and shift. The ink refused to dry, instead taking on a luminous quality that made the room seem dimmer by comparison. The strokes began to move, flowing like liquid mercury across the paper's surface. Liang tried to lift his brush, but found his hand moving independently of his will. More characters flowed onto the page: Shijian de Men, the gate of time. The calligraphy began to glow more brightly, and suddenly the individual characters were lifting from the paper, floating in the air before him like living things. The floating characters began to circle his wrist, wrapping around it like a bracelet of light. Liang felt a strange warmth spreading up his arm, and the room began to spin. The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was his own reflection in the museum's window, but instead of his usual modern clothes, he seemed to be wearing flowing robes of deep blue silk. When consciousness returned, it came with the acrid smell of burning wood and the distant sound of celebration. Liang's eyes opened to reveal not the familiar ceiling of the restoration room, but rough wooden beams blackened with soot. He was lying on a simple straw mat in what appeared to be a guard station, his wrists bound with hemp rope. The clothes on his body were indeed the blue silk robes he had glimpsed in his reflection, though he had no memory of changing. Through a small window he could see crowds gathered in a vast courtyard, their voices raised in unified chanting that made his skin prickle with its intensity. Red banners fluttered in the wind, bearing characters he recognized but had never seen displayed with such fresh authority. Qin, Qin. 2 guards entered the chamber, their bronze weapons gleaming and their expressions stern. They spoke in a dialect that was both familiar and strange, classical Chinese, but pronounced with regional variations that Liang had only encountered in his deepest studies of ancient texts. "The strange one awakens," said the taller guard, "found wandering near the palace gates, dressed in foreign silk but speaking no words. The captain thinks he might be a spy from the northern tribes." Liang tried to speak, but the words that emerged from his throat sounded wrong in this place, his modern Beijing accent as foreign as a barbarian tongue. The guards exchanged glances. "Bring writing materials," the shorter guard commanded a servant. "If he cannot speak properly, perhaps he can write. We'll see how educated this supposed mute might be." When the brush and ink arrived, Liang's hands moved with sudden confidence. He wrote in the formal script of the Qin court, I am Liang Wen, a scholar of texts. I mean no harm to the state or its people. I seek only to serve with my knowledge of written words. The guard studied his writing with growing amazement. The characters were flawless, not merely correct, but written with the kind of precision that came from years of practice in the imperial style. This was not the crude approximation of a foreign imitator, but the hand of someone trained in the highest court traditions. "Impossible," whispered the taller guard. "This writing is perfect. Too perfect. How does a wandering mute write better than the palace scribes?" Word of the mysterious stranger with the masterful calligraphy spread quickly through the ranks. By evening, Liang found himself standing before a senior court official named Wei Zhao, a man whose sharp eyes missed nothing and whose silk robes proclaimed his high rank. "You claim to be a scholar," Wei Zhao said, studying Liang with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to detecting deception. "Yet you dress strangely and speak as though our language is unfamiliar to your tongue. Where do you come from?" Liang chose his words carefully, speaking slowly to minimize his accent. "I have lived far from the capital, honoured sir. I have spent my years in study rather than in conversation, which explains my awkward speech. I offer my skills in writing and copying to serve the Son of Heaven." Li Zhao gestured to a nearby scribe. "Write the Mandate of Heaven proclamation from yesterday's ceremony." Without hesitation, Liang began to write. He had studied this very text in modern museums, Emperor Qin Shi Huang's declaration of unified rule over all under heaven. But here, now, it was not ancient history but current events. As he wrote, he realized with growing wonder and terror that he was witnessing the moment when China became China. His calligraphy flowed across the silk with perfect confidence. Every stroke placement, every character spacing, every subtle variation that marked the difference between competent copying and true mastery. It all emerged from his brush as though he had been born to this moment. When he finished, the room fell silent. Wei Zhao examined the text with increasing amazement, comparing it to official copies. The writing was not merely accurate, it was superior to the work of the court's own master scribes. "This is extraordinary," Wei Zhao murmured. "Your hand writes with the authority of the ancients. Where did you learn such precision?" "From the masters of old," Liang replied carefully. "I have studied their techniques until they became my own." That night, installed in a small but clean chamber within the palace complex, Liang tried to make sense of his situation. The ink stains on his fingers were still visible, but they had taken on a strange silvery quality that seemed to pulse with their own light. He was somehow in ancient China, in the very court of Qin Shi Huang, and his modern expertise in classical calligraphy had earned him a place among the empire's scholarly elite. Over the following days, Liang was gradually integrated into the palace bureaucracy. He copied imperial edicts, recorded audience proceedings, and helped maintain the vast archives that documented the empire's administrative operations. His colleagues marvelled at his technique but gradually accepted his presence, attributing his occasional linguistic oddities to regional differences and his obvious scholarly isolation. It was during his third week at court that he first encountered Mei. She was delivering tea to the scribal offices, moving with the quiet efficiency expected of palace servants. But Liang noticed something others had missed. Her eyes lingered on the text spread across his desk, and he caught her lips silently forming the shapes of characters as she read. Most servants in the palace were illiterate. Reading was a skill reserved for the scholarly and administrative classes, strictly controlled and carefully monitored. Yet this woman was clearly following the meaning of complex imperial documents. When she returned the next day, Liang deliberately left a piece of writing where she would see it. A poem he had composed in classical style, describing the beauty of winter moonlight on water. As she set down his teacup, her eyes went immediately to the text, and he saw her smile at a particularly clever turn of phrase. "You read beautifully," he said quietly when they were alone. May's face went pale with terror. Being caught reading without authorization could mean punishment or death, depending on the content and the mood of the officials involved. "I cannot read, honoured scholar," she said quickly. "I was merely admiring the shape of your brushwork." "The poem describes how moonlight dances on water like scattered pearls," Liang continued gently. "I noticed you smile at the line comparing the moon's reflection to a dragon's scales. Only someone who understood the meaning would find that metaphor amusing." May stood frozen, caught between denial and the relief of finally being recognized for her hidden knowledge. "Please," she whispered. "If they knew—" "They will not know from me," Liang assured her. but I am curious how you learned. Literacy is not common among the servant classes." After a long moment, May sat down across from him, her decision made. "My grandfather was a court scholar before the unification," she said. "He taught me in secret, saying that knowledge was the only inheritance that could never be taken away. When he died, I sought work in the palace to be near the books and learning, even if I could only glimpse them while serving tea." "Your grandfather was wise," Liang said. "Knowledge is indeed the most precious inheritance." "But not the only inheritance that matters," May replied with unusual intensity. "Some legacies carry blood as well as wisdom." Over the following weeks, as autumn deepened toward winter, Liang found himself drawn into increasingly complex court intrigues. Emperor Qin Shi Huang's obsession with immortality was consuming vast resources and driving increasingly desperate experiments. Alchemists promised elixirs of eternal life, while architects designed tombs meant to house the emperor's spirit for all eternity. It was during a late-night copying session in the Imperial Archives that Liang first learned about the Terracotta Army. He was transcribing supply lists when he encountered requisitions that made no sense. Thousands of bronze weapons, rivers of mercury, and most puzzling of all, detailed specifications for what appeared to be life-size clay sculptures of soldiers. "You seem confused by the tomb project," said a voice behind him. Liang turned to find Master Liu, the chief archivist, studying him with intelligent eyes. Liu was one of the few scholars who seemed genuinely interested in Liang's unusual background rather than suspicious of it. "I have never seen records of such an undertaking," Liang admitted. "The scale seems unprecedented." Master Liu sat down beside him, lowering his voice. "The Son of Heaven believes that he will rule not only in this life but in the next. The tomb being prepared will house an entire army to protect him in death, each soldier crafted to appear as lifelike as those who serve him in this world." Liang's breath caught. He was witnessing the creation of one of history's greatest archaeological wonders from the inside, seeing it not as an ancient marvel but as a contemporary construction project, driven by one man's refusal to accept mortality. "But surely," Liang said carefully, "even the Son of Heaven must eventually—" "Die?" Master Liu finished. "He has forbidden that word to be spoken in his presence. He consults with mystics and alchemists daily, seeking the secret of eternal life. Some say he has already found it." That night, alone in his chamber, Liang studied the ink stains on his fingers more carefully. They had grown brighter over his weeks in ancient China, and he began to suspect they were more than mere decoration. When he pressed his fingertips against fresh parchment, faint characters appeared, modern Chinese mixed with ancient script, forming messages he didn't remember writing. One message, repeated several times, filled him with cold dread. "The burning comes at winter's end. Save what must be saved." He recognized the reference immediately. Historical records spoke of Emperor Qin Shi Huang's order to burn books and bury scholars alive, an attempt to control knowledge by destroying everything that contradicted imperial ideology. It was one of history's great cultural catastrophes, erasing centuries of philosophical and literary achievement. Liang began to understand why he had been sent to this time and place. He was not merely an observer, but a guardian, tasked with preserving knowledge that would otherwise be lost forever. But how could one man save books from an emperor's wrath? The answer came through May. During one of their careful conversations, she revealed a secret that changed everything. "My family name is not what I have told you," she said as they walked in the palace's moonlit gardens. "My true lineage traces to the House of Chu, to the royal blood that ruled before the unification. If this were known, I would be executed immediately as a potential threat to imperial legitimacy." Liang felt the pieces of an impossible puzzle beginning to align. "Royal blood," he repeated slowly. "Is there significance to that beyond political danger?" May looked at him strangely. "You speak as though you come from a place where such things do not matter. But yes, royal blood carries power beyond politics. It can bind oaths, seal curses, and open pathways that remain closed to common ancestry." That night, studying the temple ash that still clung beneath his fingernails, Liang began to understand the full scope of his situation. He had been transported through time not by accident, but by design, pulled backward by forces that required specific elements to function: the ink of a master calligrapher, the ash of burned wisdom, and, he was beginning to suspect, the presence of royal blood. But if royal blood was required for the magic that had brought him here, it might also be required for the magic that could return him home. As winter deepened and the Emperor's paranoia grew more intense, reports began filtering through the palace of scholars being arrested on suspicion of disloyalty. Books that questioned imperial policy were being confiscated and burned. The great purge that Liang knew from history was beginning to unfold. It was Mei who brought him the most crucial intelligence. Working in the palace kitchens gave her access to gossip from every level of the imperial hierarchy, and the servants' network carried information that never appeared in official reports. "They are planning something terrible," she whispered as they met in a storage room filled with silk scrolls awaiting copying. "Master Wei has compiled lists of scholars suspected of harbouring forbidden books. Your name is not on the current list, but Master Liu's is." Liang's blood went cold. Master Liu had been his most valuable ally in accessing the palace archives, and more importantly, he had become a genuine friend. One of the few people in this ancient world who seemed to understand Liang's deep reverence for preserving knowledge. "When?" Liang asked. "Tomorrow night. They plan to arrest him and seize all materials from the archives for examination. Anything deemed subversive will be destroyed." Liang spent that night in frantic preparation. He could not save all the knowledge that would be lost, but he could save some. Working by candlelight, he began copying the most valuable texts onto silk scrolls small enough to hide. Philosophy, poetry, historical records, scientific observations. He wrote until his fingers cramped and his eyes burned. But as dawn approached, he realized the futility of his efforts. Even if he could hide these copies, even if they survived the coming purges, they would remain lost in ancient China. The knowledge needed to return to his own time to have any lasting value. The solution came to him as he watched the sun rise over the palace walls. He needed to create a text that would survive not just the immediate burning, but the passage of time itself, something that would eventually find its way to modern scholars who could understand its significance. And he needed royal blood to make the magic work. The conversation with Mei was the most difficult of his life. They met in the archives as Master Liu was being led away in chains, his face bearing the resigned dignity of a scholar who had always known this day might come. "I need your help," Liang told Mei as they watched their friend disappear into the palace's darker corridors. "But what I'm asking will require sacrifice beyond anything you can imagine. Tell me," she said simply. Liang explained everything: his true origin, the nature of his journey through time, and the growing certainty that he had been sent to preserve knowledge that would otherwise be lost. But to return home with that knowledge, to ensure it survived for future generations, he needed to write it in ink mixed with royal blood during a lunar eclipse. "The next eclipse comes at winter's end," he said. 8 more moons. If we can survive until then, if we can gather the knowledge that must be saved, we can ensure that something of value survives this destruction." Mei listened in silence, her face reflecting the flickering light of the oil lamps that illuminated the archives. When he finished, she sat quietly for a long moment. "You're asking me to die," she said finally. "I'm asking you to choose," Liang replied. "The blood required doesn't necessarily mean death. A few drops might be sufficient. But I cannot know for certain, and the magic that brought me here was not gentle. And if I refuse, then I remain here in this time and watch as centuries of wisdom burn. The knowledge I carry of what will be lost dies with me, and history unfolds as it always has." Mei stood and walked to one of the archive shelves, running her fingers along the spines of scrolls that contained the accumulated wisdom of generations. "These books," she said, "they represent the thoughts and discoveries of thousands of scholars across hundreds of years. If they're destroyed, all those voices fall silent forever." "Yes," Liang said. "And you believe that sacrificing my blood, perhaps my life, could preserve their voices for future generations. I believe it's possible, but I cannot promise success, and I cannot minimize the risk to you." Mei was quiet for another long moment. Then she turned back to him with the serene expression of someone who had found absolute certainty. "My grandfather once told me that the greatest honor for a scholar is to ensure that knowledge survives beyond their own lifetime. I may not be a scholar by training, but I am one by choice. If my blood can preserve these voices, then it's a worthy use of my life." The weeks that followed were a careful dance of preparation and secrecy. By day, they performed their duties as scribe and servant, maintaining the appearance of normal palace life. By night, they worked in hidden corners of the archives, selecting and copying the most valuable texts that were likely to be destroyed. Liang focused on works that he knew from historical study had been completely lost. Philosophical treatises that had been referenced by later scholars but never quoted in full. Scientific observations that had been forgotten for centuries. Poems that existed only as fragments in modern collections. This knowledge, preserved and returned to the modern world, could revolutionize understanding of ancient Chinese civilization. But as the lunar eclipse approached and the emperor's purges intensified, they faced an unexpected obstacle. The palace was being sealed section by section as paranoia reached fever pitch. Guards now monitored the archives constantly, and movements within the palace were severely restricted. "We need to get outside the palace walls for the ritual," Liang explained as they huddled in a storage room. "The eclipse must be observed from open ground, with no barriers between the sky and the ceremony." "The gates are watched day and night," May replied. "And even if we could escape, being found outside the palace without authorization would mean immediate execution." The solution came from an unexpected source. Master Liu, imprisoned but not yet executed, managed to send them a message through the servant network. Hidden beneath the palace was a complex of tunnels that connected to ancient burial chambers predating the current dynasty. One tunnel, he indicated, led to a grove of trees outside the palace walls, a place where imperial astronomers had once observed celestial events. The night of the eclipse, they gathered the materials they would need: the carefully copied texts, brushes and ink, and a ceremonial knife that May had acquired from the palace armory. The blade was ancient, its bronze surface inscribed with characters that neither of them could fully decipher. The tunnel was exactly where Master Liu had indicated, concealed behind a false wall in the deepest archive storage room. It was narrow and treacherous, carved through living rock and barely wide enough for a single person. They crawled through absolute darkness, guided only by the faint movement of air that suggested an opening ahead. When they finally emerged, it was into a grove of ancient cypress trees whose branches formed a natural cathedral open to the sky. The moon hung directly overhead, a perfect silver disk that was just beginning to show the first shadow of eclipse at its eastern edge. Lee spread the copied texts on a flat stone that seemed to have been placed there specifically for ceremonial purposes. The scrolls contained everything they had managed to preserve: philosophical discussions on the nature of governance and morality, scientific observations of astronomical phenomena, poems that captured the beauty and tragedy of human experience, and historical records that would otherwise have been lost forever. "Are you certain?" he asked May one final time. She nodded, her face calm in the moonlight. "I've never been more certain of anything." As the eclipse reached totality, and the moon became a disk of deep red floating in the star-filled sky, May drew the ceremonial knife across her palm. Her blood, black in the eclipse light, dripped into the ink that Liang had prepared using the same techniques that had brought him to this time. But as he dipped his brush into the mixture of ink and royal blood, Liang realized they had been discovered. Torches appeared between the trees, and the sound of armoured soldiers crashing through the underbrush shattered the grove's ancient silence. "Traitors!" shouted a voice he recognized. Wei Jiao, the official who had first tested his calligraphy. "Seize them!" May grabbed Liang's arm with her uninjured hand. "Write quickly," she urged. "Whatever happens to us, complete the ritual." Guards poured into the grove, their bronze weapons gleaming in the torchlight. Liang began to write his name in the ancient script, but his brush was shaking and the characters came out unsteady and weak. "I can't concentrate," he said desperately. "The magic requires precision and—" May stepped between him and the advancing soldiers. "I'll give you time," she said, and then she began to speak in a voice that carried absolute authority. "I am May of the House of Chu," she declared, her words ringing across the grove. "Daughter of the royal bloodline that ruled these lands before the Qin, I claim the ancient right of final words." The guards hesitated. Even in the current dynasty, certain traditions carried power that transcended political change. The right of royal blood to speak before execution was one of the oldest laws, predating the unification itself. Wei Jiao pushed through his soldiers, his face twisted with rage. "Royal blood or common, you will die for this treachery, but speak quickly if you must." As May began what everyone present understood to be her final statement, Liang forced himself to focus on the calligraphy. The eclipse was at its deepest point now, and the ink mixed with royal blood seemed to glow with its own light. His brush moved with increasing confidence as the familiar rhythms of perfect calligraphy took over. I speak not for mercy, May was saying, but for memory. The knowledge that you seek to destroy tonight represents the accumulated wisdom of generations. By burning it, you do not strengthen the empire, you weaken it by cutting it off from its own roots. Liang finished writing his name and moved on to the spell of return that he hoped would carry both him and the preserved knowledge back to his own time. The characters flowed onto the silk with supernatural precision, each stroke perfectly placed despite the chaos surrounding them. Knowledge is not the enemy of authority, May continued. It is the foundation upon which true authority stands. A ruler who fears the wisdom of the past fears his own inadequacy to match it. Wei Zhao's patience finally snapped. Enough, he shouted, raising his sword. Die with your precious books, royal daughter of a fallen house. But as his blade descended toward May, the ritual reached its climax. The ink on Liang's brush began to shine like liquid starlight, and the characters he had written rose from the silk to circle around both him and May in spirals of silver light. The last thing Liang saw before the world dissolved into brilliance was May's face, peaceful and proud, as the sword that should have killed her passed harmlessly through the space where she stood. He awakened in the restoration room of the Beijing Museum, slumped over his work table with the morning sun streaming through the windows. For a moment he wondered if the entire experience had been an elaborate dream, brought on by too many late nights and too much solitary work. But then he looked down at his hands and saw that they held a brush still wet with ink, and spread before him on the work table was a silk scroll covered with calligraphy in his own precise hand. The text was unlike anything in the museum's collection, a complete philosophical treatise on governance and morality, written in flawless Qin dynasty script, containing ideas that scholars had thought were lost forever. As he read through the text, Liang realized that he had somehow managed to preserve everything he and May had copied in ancient China. The scroll contained not just individual works, but comprehensive discussions that filled gaps in historical knowledge that had puzzled scholars for generations. Here were the missing sections of text that existed only in fragments, complete poems by authors known only by name, scientific observations that predated similar discoveries by centuries. But the most shocking discovery came at the scroll's end. There, in a section he didn't remember writing, was a detailed account of his own journey through time, written in the voice of someone who had been present for the events but observing from the outside. The account was signed with a name that made his blood run cold. May of the House of Chu, Keeper of Memory. Over the following days, as word of the discovery spread through academic circles, Liang found himself at the centre of a scholarly sensation. The scroll's contents revolutionized understanding of Qin dynasty intellectual life, and Liang's reputation as a restorer and researcher was permanently established. But private investigation revealed something even more extraordinary. DNA analysis of blood traces found on the scroll, blood that had somehow remained fresh despite the document's apparent age, revealed genetic markers that matched Liang's own profile with stunning precision. The implications were clear. The blood came from someone who shared his ancestry. Further genealogical research, conducted with resources that only his new celebrity status made available, traced his family line back through generations of scholars and minor officials to a source that made his hands tremble as he read the records. His family descended from a minor branch of the Chu royal house, a bloodline that had survived the fall of the old kingdoms by obscurity and careful anonymity. Liang was royal blood. He had always carried within him the power that had made his journey possible, though he had never known it existed. The realization brought both wonder and profound grief. May had sacrificed herself to preserve knowledge for future generations, never knowing that the stranger she helped was carrying the same royal bloodline that flowed in her own veins. They had been distant cousins, connected across centuries by heritage and by their shared dedication to preserving the voices of the past. In the month that followed, Liang threw himself into his work with renewed purpose. The scroll became the foundation for a new understanding of ancient Chinese intellectual history, and he became the scholar most qualified to interpret its contents. But he never forgot that every character on that silk had been purchased with May's willing sacrifice. He established a small shrine in his apartment, where he burned incense each night for May's memory, and he dedicated every scholarly paper he published to those who gave their lives so that knowledge might survive. His colleagues assumed this was a general dedication to ancient scholars who had died during historical purges, never suspecting that it referred to one specific person who had died to preserve the very texts they now studied. Sometimes, working late in the restoration room where his journey had begun, Liang would find traces of silver in his ink, faint threads of light that reminded him of the magic that had carried him across time. He never tried to recreate the circumstances that had sent him to ancient China. The knowledge had been preserved, the voices of the past had been saved, and May's sacrifice had achieved its purpose. But on nights when the moon was dark and the museum was silent around him, Liang would sometimes write her name in classical characters, brush loaded with the finest ink he could prepare. And sometimes, just sometimes, he imagined he could see approval in the way the characters dried on the paper, a sign that somewhere across centuries, May of the House of Chu knew that her sacrifice had not been in vain. The scroll remained the crowning achievement of his career, but Liang understood that his true legacy lay not in the fame it brought him, but in the voices it had preserved. Each night as he worked, surrounded by the whispers of ancient texts and the gentle scratch of brush against paper, he honoured the memory of a woman who had chosen to die so that knowledge might live. And in the growing collection of texts he continued to restore and preserve, in the students he trained to carry on the work of keeping ancient voices alive, and in every character he wrote with the precision that had made him worthy of a place in Emperor Qin Shi Huang's court, the spirit of May's sacrifice continued to touch the world. The forgotten ink had remembered everything that mattered most. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Daniel Mercer adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and squinted at the faded ink on yet another yellowed document. The restricted wing of the Whitmore Historical Archive smelled of dust and decay, tinged with the chemical tang of preservation solutions. At 21, Daniel had already spent more hours in archives than most people spent in their cars, his pale complexion testament to countless days hunched over historical manuscripts, instead of enjoying the California sunshine outside. The cultural impact of Lincoln's death. His thesis title stared back at him from the laptop screen, cursor blinking impatiently after only 3 paragraphs of introduction. He'd been researching for months, but something felt missing, some crucial understanding that would elevate his work beyond mere academic regurgitation. His professor, Dr. Hartwell, had granted him special access to this restricted collection, trusting Daniel's reputation as the most dedicated Civil War scholar in the undergraduate program. The archive stretched around him in oppressive silence, broken only by the occasional settling creak of old wood and the distant rumble of thunder from the storm gathering outside. Daniel had arrived early that morning, armed with coffee and determination, but now, as evening approached, fatigue weighed on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He pushed back from the reading desk and wandered deeper into the collection, past rows of climate-controlled cases containing artifacts most people would never see. A Confederate officer's sword, tarnished and nicked, letters from soldiers to sweethearts who would never read them, fragments of a nation torn apart and slowly stitched back together. Then he saw it. In a corner case, partially obscured by shadow, sat a pocket watch. Unlike the other pristine artifacts around it, this one showed clear damage. The crystal face was spider-webbed with cracks, and the gold casing bore deep scratches. But what drew Daniel's attention wasn't the watch itself, but what lay beside it. A blood-stained playbill from Ford's Theatre dated April 14th, 1865. The paper was brown with age, but he could still make out the elegant typography advertising Our American Cousin starring Laura Keane. Daniel's heart quickened. He'd read about artifacts from that terrible night, but he'd never seen actual physical evidence. The playbill was positioned so that only a portion was visible beneath the watch, as if someone had deliberately arranged them together. His academic instincts screamed at him to find a curator, to follow proper procedures, but his curiosity proved stronger. The case wasn't locked, unusual for such significant artifacts. Daniel glanced around the empty archive, then carefully lifted the glass top. The musty scent of old metal and paper wafted up, carrying with it an almost electric tang that made his fingertips tingle. He picked up the watch first, surprised by its weight. The back was engraved with initials he couldn't quite make out in the dim light, worn smooth by decades of handling. When he turned it over, the cracked face showed hands frozen at 10:15, the exact moment John Wilkes Booth had fired his derringer into the back of Abraham Lincoln's head. "Poor bastard," Daniel murmured, his voice unnaturally loud in the silence. If only someone had warned you. If only someone had been there to stop it. He turned the watch over in his hands, noting the intricate engravings along the rim. History would be so different. No martyred Lincoln, no mythologizing of the presidency. Maybe Reconstruction would have actually worked. Maybe we wouldn't have spent the next century and a half dealing with the aftermath of that one bullet. As he spoke, his thumb found a small protrusion on the watch's side, a tiny button or lever he hadn't noticed before. The moment he pressed it, the watch began to emit a faint humming sound, barely audible, but somehow felt in his bones. Outside, the storm intensified. Lightning flashed through the archive's small windows, casting sharp shadows across the collection. Daniel was so focused on the watch that he barely noticed the change in atmospheric pressure, the way the air seemed to thicken around him. The playbill beneath the watch had shifted when he'd lifted it, revealing more of the stained surface. Without thinking, Daniel reached for it, his fingers touching the ancient paper, just as another lightning strike illuminated the building. The electrical charge seemed to flow through the windows, down the metal shelving, and directly into the watch in his hands. The humming intensified to a roar. The cracked crystal face began to glow with an internal light that had nothing to do with electricity. Daniel tried to drop the watch, but his fingers seemed frozen around it, as if the metal had fused to his skin. The playbill in his other hand grew hot, the bloodstain shifting from brown to red as if the paper remembered the night it was first stained. The world tilted. Daniel's vision blurred, colours bleeding together like watercolours in rain. The archive walls stretched and warped, the ceiling disappearing into darkness while the floor seemed to fall away beneath his feet. The last thing he saw before consciousness fled was the watch face, its frozen hands beginning to move backward, counting down the minutes to 10:15 p.m., April 14th, 1865. Daniel awoke to the sound of horses and the smell of coal smoke. His head throbbed as he struggled to sit up, finding himself in an alley between two brick buildings. Gas lamps flickered along the street beyond, casting wavering pools of yellow light on muddy cobblestones. The air was thick with the scents of horse manure, cooking food, and unwashed bodies, a far cry from the antiseptic atmosphere of the archive. Panic seized him as he patted his pockets, finding the watch and playbill still clutched in his hands. But his modern clothes were gone, replaced by a worn wool suit that might have belonged in a costume shop. His smartphone was nowhere to be found, replaced by an unfamiliar weight in his inner jacket pocket, a small leather wallet containing what appeared to be period-appropriate identification papers, naming him as Daniel Morrison, Union Army aide. The implications hit him like a physical blow. Either he was having the most vivid hallucination of his life, or the impossible had happened. The thunder of hooves on cobblestones and the distant sound of a military band suggested the latter. Daniel forced himself to stand, legs shaky beneath him. The alley opened onto a broad avenue where carriages and pedestrians moved with purpose despite the late hour. Ladies in long dresses and gentlemen in top hats hurried along wooden sidewalks, their faces lit by gaslight. A newsboy on the corner shouted headlines about Confederate General Lee's recent surrender at Appomattox, April 1865. It had to be. But which day? Daniel approached the newsboy with careful steps, digging coins from his pocket. Coins that felt real, that bore the wear of actual circulation. "Boy," he called, adopting what he hoped was appropriate speech for the era. "What date is this?" "April 11th, sir," the boy replied eagerly, recognizing a potential customer. "Lee's surrendered. War's all but over. President Lincoln's planning a grand celebration." April 11th. 3 days before Ford's Theatre. 3 days before Booth would fire the shot that would echo through history. Daniel's knees nearly buckled with the weight of realization and opportunity. He spent the next 2 days in a kind of fever dream, using his extensive knowledge of the period to navigate 1865 Washington. His supposed credentials as a Union Army aide granted him access to government buildings and social circles that would have been impossible for a civilian. He learned that Lincoln was indeed planning to attend Our American Cousin on the 14th, that John Wilkes Booth was already in the city, that the conspiracy was falling into place exactly as Daniel had read about in countless history books. The moral weight of his situation pressed down on him like a physical burden. Here was Abraham Lincoln, alive and breathing, planning Reconstruction policies that would bind the nation's wounds. Daniel had seen the great man twice now, once at a distance during a public appearance, once passing through a government building. Lincoln looked tired, aged beyond his years by the weight of war, but his eyes still held that spark of humanity that had made him beloved by millions. Could Daniel really stand by and let this man die? Every instinct screamed at him to find some way to warn Lincoln, to prevent the tragedy. But another part of him, the historian, understood the terrible calculus involved. Lincoln's death had made him a martyr, had created the political capital necessary for the 13th, 14th and 15th Amendments. His assassination had shocked the nation into a kind of unified grief that might not have existed otherwise. But those were abstract considerations. Standing in 1865 Washington, seeing Lincoln as a living, breathing human being rather than a historical figure, the moral choice seemed clear. Daniel began to plan. April 14th dawned grey and overcast. Daniel positioned himself near Ford's Theatre in the early evening, watching as carriages arrived and well-dressed theatre-goers filed into the building. He spotted John Wilkes Booth almost immediately. The actor was unmistakable, his dark hair and moustache exactly matching the photographs Daniel had studied. Booth moved with the easy confidence of a man comfortable in social situations, greeting acquaintances and charming ladies with practised ease. Daniel's plan was simple. Create a distraction that would delay Lincoln's arrival at the theatre, throwing off Booth's timing and giving the president's security detail a chance to intervene. He'd studied the assassination enough to know that everything depended on precise timing. Booth needed to know exactly where Lincoln would be and when. As Lincoln's carriage approached the theatre, Daniel put his plan into action. He stepped into the street and began loudly proclaiming news of Confederate General Johnston's surrender in North Carolina, news that was actually several days premature but plausible enough to cause excitement. Within moments, a crowd had gathered around him, blocking the street and forcing Lincoln's carriage to stop. From his position in the crowd, Daniel could see Lincoln himself leaning out of the carriage window, his face lighting up with genuine joy at the news. The president even called out a few words of celebration, his distinctive voice carrying over the noise of the crowd. But the delay had worked. By the time Lincoln's party finally entered the theatre, they were nearly 20 minutes behind schedule. Daniel watched from across the street as the evening unfolded. He saw Booth enter the theatre, saw the actor's growing agitation as he realised his target wasn't where he expected. Through the theatre's windows, Daniel could make out movement in the presidential box, but the timing was all wrong now. Booth's carefully laid plans had been disrupted. The shots Daniel expected never came. As the evening wore on and the play concluded, Lincoln emerged from the theatre alive and unharmed, waving to the crowd that had gathered outside. Booth slipped away into the night, his assassination attempt foiled by nothing more than bad timing. The watch in Daniel's pocket had begun to grow warm again, its subtle humming returning. He pulled it out, seeing that the cracked face was once again glowing with that strange internal light. The playbill in his other pocket seemed to pulse with sympathetic energy. Whatever force had brought him here was preparing to take him back. Daniel closed his eyes and concentrated, trying to recreate the conditions that had triggered his original journey. The storm had passed, but the watch seemed to respond to his intentions, its glow intensifying until the light penetrated his closed eyelids. The world began to spin again, colours bleeding together as past and present collided. When the disorientation passed, Daniel found himself back in the Whitmore archive, but something was fundamentally wrong. The building was the same, but the collection had changed. Where Civil War artifacts had once filled the cases, he now saw displays celebrating the Great Lincoln Republic and the Imperial Expansion era. Maps on the walls showed an America that stretched from Alaska to Panama, with territories extending into the Caribbean and Pacific that Daniel had never seen in any history book. His laptop was still open on the reading desk, but the screen now showed a different thesis title: The Necessity of Imperial Unity, Lincoln's Vision Realized. The introduction he'd written had changed completely, discussing Lincoln's successful Reconstruction policies and the benevolent authoritarianism that had emerged in the decades following the war. Daniel's hand shook as he accessed the internet, searching for familiar historical touchstones. What he found horrified him. Lincoln had indeed lived, serving an unprecedented third term before passing power to a hand-picked successor. The United States had never experienced the guilt and reconciliation that followed Lincoln's assassination in the original timeline. Instead, Lincoln's survival had enabled him to pursue increasingly harsh Reconstruction policies, leading to a permanent federal occupation of the South and the gradual erosion of democratic institutions in favour of efficient governance. The America of this timeline was a global superpower, but one built on military might and cultural suppression. The Civil War's end had not brought healing, but had instead entrenched divisions that festered for generations. Regional resistance to federal authority had been met with increasingly authoritarian responses, creating a cycle of repression that had never been broken. In saving Lincoln, Daniel had doomed the country to a different kind of tragedy, not the sharp, shocking wound of assassination, but the slow strangulation of liberty in the name of order. The martyred Lincoln of the original timeline had become a symbol of unity and redemption. The living Lincoln of this timeline had become something far more complex and ultimately destructive. Daniel stared at the changed artifacts around him, understanding with crystal clarity what he had to do. The watch was still in his pocket, warm to the touch. The playbill, now commemorating the night democracy was saved, lay beside his laptop. He had the tools to return, to make things right. But making things right meant ensuring that Abraham Lincoln died. The moral weight of that realization nearly crushed him. In the original timeline, he had been tormented by the possibility of preventing a good man's death. Now he faced the even more terrible burden of ensuring that death occurred, not because Lincoln deserved to die, but because his living had somehow poisoned the future in ways the great man could never have foreseen. Daniel spent hours in the Changed Archive researching this new timeline's history, trying to understand how Lincoln's survival had led to such a dystopian outcome. The pattern became clear. Without the shock of his assassination, Lincoln had been free to pursue his more radical Reconstruction ideas. The South's resistance had been met with increasingly harsh federal intervention. The precedent of emergency powers had never been relinquished, passing from one administration to the next until democracy had been strangled by its own institutions. The Lincoln of this timeline had lived to see his vision implemented, but that vision, unchecked by the moderating influence of martyrdom, had grown into something monstrous. The man who had saved the Union had ultimately destroyed the Republic. As evening approached, Daniel made his decision. He took the watch and the playbill, now understanding their significance in ways he hadn't before. These weren't just random artifacts, they were anchors, physical connections to a moment of historical pivot that allowed him to return and make changes. The watch marked the time, the playbill marked the place, and together they created a pathway through time's labyrinth. The transition back to 1865 was easier this time, as if the mechanism had learned his patterns. Daniel found himself in the same alley, but with foreknowledge of what was to come. This time he knew Booth's plans in detail, knew exactly how the assassination was supposed to unfold. More importantly, he knew what he had done wrong the first time. April 14th arrived again, but Daniel's approach was entirely different. Instead of trying to prevent the assassination, he had to ensure it happened while avoiding direct complicity in murder. The moral complexity was staggering. He had to become a kind of negative guardian angel, smoothing the path for tragedy while maintaining his own humanity. Daniel spent the day identifying the key factors that could disrupt Booth's plan. The actor needed several things to align perfectly: access to the theatre, knowledge of Lincoln's precise location, and the absence of adequate security in the presidential box. In the original timeline, a crucial guard had been absent from his post, called away on a trivial errand that had never seemed suspicious until historians examined it decades later. Now Daniel understood his role. He wasn't meant to kill Lincoln. He was meant to ensure that the historical mechanisms functioned as they had originally. When he overheard a Union officer discussing additional security for the theatre, Daniel subtly redirected the conversation toward concerns about Confederate agents in other parts of the city. When he learned that Lincoln's usual bodyguard was considering staying close to the presidential box, Daniel dropped hints about suspicious activity near the War Department that might require investigation. Each action felt like a betrayal of everything he believed in, but Daniel forced himself to continue. He was not killing Lincoln, he was simply allowing history to proceed as it had originally been written. The president's fate had been sealed by forces far larger than one confused time traveller. The evening unfolded with terrible inevitability. Daniel positioned himself where he could see both the theatre entrance and the alley where Booth would make his escape. As the familiar carriages arrived and the audience filed into the building, Daniel felt the weight of the watch in his pocket like a physical accusation. Soon it would mark 10:15 p.m. again, and Abraham Lincoln would become a martyr instead of a tyrant. But something was wrong. Booth was nowhere to be seen. Daniel's earlier intervention had apparently had consequences he hadn't anticipated. The actor's plans had changed, adapted to the new circumstances. Panic seized Daniel as he realised that his attempts to restore the original timeline might have created yet another deviation. He spent precious minutes searching the area around the theatre, finally spotting Booth in deep conversation with another man near a tavern 2 blocks away. Even from a distance, Daniel could see the actor's agitation. Whatever Booth was planning, it wasn't the straightforward theatre infiltration that history recorded. Daniel edged closer, straining to overhear their conversation. Booth was arguing for an immediate strike. Apparently he'd grown suspicious of the changing security arrangements and wanted to attack Lincoln's carriage as it returned from the theatre. His companion was urging patience, but Booth seemed beyond reason, driven by the same fanatical energy that had made him willing to commit murder in the first place. If Booth attacked the carriage, everything would change again. The location, the timing, the symbolic impact, all of it would be different. Lincoln might survive a carriage attack, or he might die in a way that created different historical ripples. Daniel couldn't allow either outcome. Moving quickly, Daniel approached the tavern and deliberately bumped into Booth's companion, spilling the man's drink and creating enough of a distraction to break up their conversation. In the confusion, he managed to whisper to Booth, "The president's box is unguarded. Now's your chance." It was perhaps the most morally compromising thing Daniel had ever done, but it served to redirect Booth back toward his original plan. Booth's eyes lit up with renewed purpose. He abandoned his companion and hurried toward the theatre, slipping in through the stage door exactly as he had in the original timeline. Daniel followed at a distance, his heart hammering in his chest as he watched history reassert itself. The rest unfolded with mechanical precision. Booth made his way to the presidential box, finding it just as Daniel had ensured it would be, accessible and poorly guarded. The sound of laughter from our American cousin masked Booth's approach. At 10:15 p.m. precisely, the shot rang out, followed by Booth's famous cry of "Sic semper tyrannis" as he leaped to the stage. Daniel closed his eyes as chaos erupted inside the theatre. He had done what history required, but the cost to his soul felt immeasurable. Abraham Lincoln was dying, and Daniel had helped ensure it happened. The knowledge that he had prevented an even greater tragedy provided cold comfort in the face of such immediate moral compromise. The watch grew warm in his pocket, its purpose fulfilled. But as Daniel prepared to trigger his return to the present, he noticed something that chilled him. Other figures in the crowd who seemed to be watching the theatre with the same focused intensity he had shown. Men and women whose clothes and mannerisms suggested they, like him, didn't quite belong in 1865. Were there others? Other time travellers with their own agendas, their own attempts to reshape history? The thought was terrifying. If the timeline was being constantly manipulated by competing forces from the future, how could anyone know what the true course of history should be? But there was no time to investigate. The watch was pulling him forward, its glow intensifying as Daniel gripped the blood-stained playbill. Whatever other forces might be at work, he had played his part in the grand tragedy. Lincoln would die, become a martyr, and inspire the kind of national healing that his living presence had somehow prevented. The transition back to the present was rougher this time, as if the timeline itself was fighting against further change. Daniel arrived in the archive gasping and disoriented, his modern clothes restored but his hands still shaking from what he had done. The artifacts around him had returned to their familiar arrangement, the displays once again celebrating the Lincoln he remembered from his own studies rather than the imperial figure from the alternate timeline. But the cost of restoration was immediately apparent. The watch in his hands was no longer just cracked, it was completely shattered, its internal mechanism scattered like metal confetti across his palm. The playbill had aged decades in moments, crumbling to dust that slipped through his fingers like sand. Whatever force had powered his journeys through time had been exhausted, leaving him stranded in a present he had fought to preserve. Daniel spent the rest of the night in the archive, researching the timeline he had restored, satisfying himself that history was once again proceeding as he remembered it. Lincoln had died a martyr, Johnson had fumbled Reconstruction, the country had struggled through decades of racial strife and regional resentment, but ultimately had emerged as the flawed democracy Daniel had always known. It wasn't perfect, far from it. The America of 2024 still struggled with the legacy of slavery, still grappled with questions of federal authority versus states' rights, still bore the scars of its violent birth. But it was a democracy, messy and contentious and alive in ways that the authoritarian state of the alternate timeline had never been. As dawn broke over the archive, Daniel finally turned his attention back to his thesis. The cursor still blinked after those same 3 paragraphs, but now he knew what he wanted to write. Not just about the cultural impact of Lincoln's death, but about the necessity of tragedy in shaping national character. About how some wounds, terrible though they might be, served purposes that healing could not. He wrote through the morning and into the afternoon, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he poured out insights gained through impossible experience. He wrote about martyrdom and memory, about the difference between a man and a symbol, about the terrible mathematics of historical necessity. He wrote about Lincoln the human being, flawed and complex and ultimately mortal, and about Lincoln the myth, perfect in death, in ways he never could have been in life. Dr. Hartwell read the completed thesis with obvious amazement, praising Daniel's psychological insight and historical sophistication. "It's as if you were actually there," the professor marvelled, not knowing how close to the truth he had come. This kind of empathetic understanding of historical figures is what separates great historians from mere chroniclers. Daniel accepted the praise with appropriate humility, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The broken watch and crumbled playbill were gone from the archive, removed by some process he didn't understand. Perhaps they had never been meant to survive their purpose. Perhaps the forces that had brought them together for those crucial moments had reclaimed them, filing them away in whatever cosmic archive housed the tools of temporal intervention. He walked past the museum on his way home from the archive, pausing at the familiar display case where the watch and playbill had once rested. The case was still there, but it now held different artifacts, a Union soldier's diary and a piece of shrapnel from Gettysburg. No sign remained of the items that had made his journey possible. Standing there in the late afternoon sunlight, Daniel felt the weight of his secret knowledge pressing down on him. He alone knew what America might have become if Lincoln had lived. He alone understood the terrible necessity of that bullet fired in Ford's Theatre on April 14th, 1865. The burden of that knowledge would stay with him always, a constant reminder of the complex relationship between intention and outcome, between individual action and historical consequence. A young woman approached the display case, reading the placard with obvious interest. She was about Daniel's age, with the intense focus of a serious student. "Terrible thing," she murmured, apparently to herself. "Such a waste. If only someone could have prevented it." Daniel almost replied, almost told her about the complexity of historical causation, about the dangers of changing the past. But he caught himself, understanding that such knowledge was his burden alone to bear. Instead, he simply nodded and walked away, leaving her to her innocent wish for a different outcome. Behind him, the museum case held its new artifacts in silent testimony to the war that had shaped a nation. Somewhere in the cosmic machinery of time, the forces that governed cause and effect continued their eternal work, ensuring that tragedy and triumph, loss and redemption played out their appointed roles in the grand theatre of history. Daniel walked home through the familiar streets of his present, carrying within him the terrible wisdom of someone who had learned that doing the right thing sometimes meant allowing the wrong thing to happen. The echoes of that boothless bullet, the shot that might never have been fired, would remain with him always, a reminder that history's greatest tragedies often served purposes that transcended the suffering of any individual moment. In the end, Abraham Lincoln had died as he was meant to die, not for the sins of the South or the satisfaction of his enemies, but for the complex needs of a future he would never see. And Daniel Mercer, keeper of that impossible secret, walked on through the gathering dusk, his thesis complete and his understanding of history forever changed by the knowledge of what might have been.